This is the second of two SY2 screencasts examining sampling techniques. Now, in the previous screencast we focused on different forms of random sampling. So the idea behind random sampling is that everybody in the target population has an equal chance or probability of being selected in your sample. And in order to do random sampling, you need a complete and up-to-date sampling frame. In other words, you need a list of all of the names of the people that are in your target population. Now, if you don't have access to a complete and up-to-date sampling frame, or you haven't got the time to compile a sampling frame, then you might have to use a non-random sampling technique. And what we're going to do in this screencast is look at some of the main examples of non-random or non-probability sampling that are used in sociology. One relatively easy way of conducting a non-random sample would be to take an opportunity sample. And this method involves the researcher simply selecting those people that are available at the time. For example, that might involve going up to people in cafes and asking them to be interviewed. And the main advantage of this simple method is that it's quick, it's convenient, and therefore economical. However, it usually produces very unrepresentative samples and is often biased by the researcher, who would likely choose people who they think look helpful. One way of making an opportunity sample more representative is to use an approach called quota sampling. And this is often used in opinion surveys and market research, as well as in sociological research. So with a quota sample, the researcher starts with a list of the characteristics of the target population. For example, they might know that the target population in question consists of 70% women and 30% men. And based on this information, they formulate a quota of people, in other words, an amount of people needed with each particular characteristic. So in the example that I've just given, if we were going to do 10 interviews, we might need to find 7 women, that would be our quota for women, and then 3 men, that would be our quota for men, because it's in proportion to their representation within the overall target population. So once you've formulated the quota of people needed, researchers then go into the field and try to actively fill this quota. Now, the main advantage of this approach is that it allows the researcher to build a representative sample without using a sampling frame. So consequently, it's the most convenient way of drawing a representative sample in sociological research. However, as we can see from the cartoon on the screen, the representativeness of this particular method may be undermined by the actual choice of participants, because this relies on the judgment of the researcher, as we can see in the image. And this makes it much more subjective than random sampling and makes the accidental introduction of bias possible. Another common approach to selecting participants is snowball sampling. And in this technique, the researcher finds an initial participant who puts them in touch with others. And these contacts are then used to find new participants, and the sample builds up like a rolling snowball. As we can see from the cartoon on the screen, the greatest benefit of this particular technique is its usefulness in gaining access to sensitive, criminal or hidden groups. And in many cases, it might be the only possible sampling technique for studying these types of groups. However, the researcher has no real way of knowing whether or not the sample obtained using this technique is representative of the overall target population. And there can also be practical problems with this approach, as it's very easy for the trail to run dry, at which point the researcher must once again find another initial contact. So obviously this could be potentially a very time-consuming approach. Finally, one of the most used techniques of gaining participants is the use of self-selecting samples, sometimes also referred to as volunteer samples. And in this approach, the researcher places an advert, for example in a newspaper, and participants volunteer to take part in the research. And the main advantage of self-selecting sampling is that it requires little money or effort on the part of the researcher, as most of the footwork is done by participants themselves. However, the people who volunteer to take part in research tend to be systematically different to the general population, and this can obviously undermine the representativeness of your sample. And furthermore, if the researcher doesn't gain the required number of volunteers in their first round of advertising, then they're going to be forced to take out further advertisements, which begins to undermine the cost-efficient nature of this particular technique.